You've seen it everywhere. The constant feed, the endless scroll, photos of vacations, meals, achievements, faces smiling at cameras held at just the right angle. Everyone is sharing. Everyone is visible. Everyone is performing. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, you wonder if something's wrong with you. Because you don't post much. Maybe you barely post at all. Not because you're ashamed. Not because you're hiding, but because something inside you doesn't feel the pull. You don't need to broadcast your life to feel like it's real. And that difference? It's not a weakness. It's a signal of something deeper. Let me tell you what most people misunderstand. Privacy isn't the same as insecurity. When you choose not to post photos of yourself, you're not retreating from the world. You're protecting something more valuable than attention. You're protecting your sense of self. See, every time someone posts a photo and waits for the reactions to roll in, their brain is looking for feedback. Likes become little bursts of validation. Comments become proof of worth. And slowly, without even realizing it, the brain starts to depend on that feedback loop. Psychologists call this external validation. You begin measuring your value by how others respond to you. But here's what happens when you step away from that. When you don't post, you're forced to build validation from the inside. You stop asking the world to tell you who you are. You start deciding for yourself. That's not isolation. That's emotional independence. And it takes more strength than most people realize. People who post less often tend to have something that others are still searching for. Self-awareness. They've thought about what actually matters to them, not what looks good, not what gets attention, but what feels true. And once you have that clarity, the urge to perform starts to fade. You don't need to prove you're happy. You just are. You don't need to show you're successful. You know your progress. You're not trying to convince anyone of anything because you're not confused about your own life. This is the difference between living and displaying. Social media trains us to think in terms of how things will look, how they'll be received, what story they'll tell about us. But when you're grounded in self-awareness, you stop caring about the story. You care about the experience itself. That shift is everything. It means you're no longer controlled by the need to be seen. You're free to simply exist. Let's go deeper. Psychologists distinguish between two types of self-esteem, fragile and secure. Fragile self-esteem depends on constant reassurance. It needs proof. It needs witnesses. It asks, "Am I enough?" and waits for the world to answer. Secure self-esteem doesn't ask that question. It already knows. When you don't feel the need to post photos of yourself, it's often because you have what's called a secure attachment to yourself. You trust your own worth. You don't need other people to confirm it. You don't need the algorithm to validate your existence. This doesn't mean you don't care about connection. It means you don't confuse connection with performance. And here's the uncomfortable truth most won't say out loud. A lot of over-posting comes from anxiety, not confidence. It's the quiet fear that if you're not visible, you'll be forgotten. That if you don't show up in the feed, you don't exist in people's minds. But you've figured out something important. Real presence doesn't require constant visibility. You know that the people who matter will remember you without the reminders. There's another layer to this. People who share less tend to think more. They process before they express. They reflect before they reveal. They're not reacting to every moment with a camera. They're experiencing it. And that difference creates depth. Psychologists talk about something called an internal locus of evaluation. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. It means you judge yourself by your own standards, not by the crowd's reaction. Most people live with an external locus of evaluation. They look outside themselves for approval. They measure success by how others respond. But when you develop an internal locus, you stop performing. You stop curating. You stop editing your life into a version that fits the platform. You just live. And that kind of authenticity is rare now. It's almost countercultural. Because everywhere you look, people are being taught to optimize for engagement, to think in captions, to turn every private moment into content. But you've resisted that. You've kept parts of yourself offline, and in doing so, you've kept them yours. Here's something worth understanding. Social media shows us highlight reels, perfectly lit moments, filtered faces, edited lives. And when you see that every day, your brain starts to compare, even when you know it's not real. This is called social comparison theory. We measure ourselves against others constantly, and the more we see curated success, the worse we feel about our unedited reality. But here's what happens when you stop posting. You stop participating in that cycle. You're no longer comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's show reel. You're not checking how your life stacks up in a grid of perfect squares. You've protected your mental energy. You've protected your peace. And most importantly, you've protected your identity. Because when you're not performing for an audience, you get to discover who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who gets the most validation. Just you. Unfiltered, unobserved, undistorted by the need to be liked. So let me say this clearly. If you don't post photos of yourself, you are not missing out. You're not invisible. You're not less successful, less happy, or less worthy than the people who do. You've simply chosen a different relationship with visibility. And that choice reflects something powerful. It reflects confidence that doesn't need to announce itself, strength that doesn't need to perform, self-worth that doesn't require an audience. True confidence is not loud. It doesn't demand to be seen. It doesn't chase reactions. It sits quietly in the background of your life, steady and unshaken. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who says the least, and sometimes the most grounded person online is the one who shows up the least. Not because they're hiding, but because they're busy living, really living. Not for the feed, not for the likes, not for proof. Just for themselves. And that's a kind of freedom most people are still searching for.